silly stuff.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Cam, and welcome back to my road to Wolfman, where I'm covering every Universal Studios Wolfman film in honor of Wolfman coming to theaters in just about a week and a half. I've already covered everything up to House of Dracula, link in the eye in the right-hand corner. Go check it out for yourself if you are so inclined. But for right now, let's get into Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. And I feel like I need to preface by saying that yes, technically speaking, this is still a Wolfman movie, even though like Larry Talbot again is barely in it. It's a bit of a mess in case you have not taken notice. The continuity is suggested, and that's like putting it rather mildly. But regardless, this is the beginning of the sort of second life of the Universal monsters. They were not being taken as seriously at this point, and instead they were teamed up with an act that had been very successful for Universal, but had gone on pretty hard times. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. It tells the story of Count Dracula, played once again by Bela Lugosi, who is trying to find a brain to put inside the body of Frankenstein's monster, and finds that the body of Wilbur Gray, played by Lou Costello, is the perfect choice, and hijinks ensue from there. By the time that this movie came out in 1948, it was very clear that the Universal monsters were pretty nerfed. And I talked about in House of Dracula for the many reasons why. Universal didn't really like doing monster films for a lot of reasons. However, originally this movie was supposed to be called The Brain of Frankenstein, playing into the very much into the plot of the film. However, for a variety of reasons, the script was rewritten and redone. Initially, the brain of Frankenstein was supposed to be given to Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, so they were basically on board with this from the very beginning. And I believe it was either Abbott or Costello who read the script and said, "My 5-year-old daughter could write something better than this." Ultimately, the title was changed to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and was leaned more into comedy because at that point, Abbott and Costello were seen as more of a priority. And if this seems like a bit of a weird marriage, it's not as weird as you think. But to make a long story short, similar to the Universal Monsters, Abbott and Costello were basically an act that were running out of new things to say. Since the dawn of the 40s, Abbott and Costello had been a gold mine for Universal. And make no mistake, Abbott and Costello had been talented for a very long time up to that point, from everything from vaudeville to radio up to television and into film. But starting in the early 40s, they had begun starring in movie vehicles of their own. With Universal, they had started with a film called Buck Privates and had even worked with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein's director, Charles Barton, on a couple of very successful projects, including Africa Screams. So you had, on paper, a bunch of elements that had worked together before and had succeeded. Is this movie any good? Yes, it is. It's actually rather funny. It's a weird movie in that up to that point, the Universal monsters had been taken somewhat seriously, but the mixture of horror and comedy usually works, and so in the case of this movie, it does largely work. The plot is barely a plot and is just a vehicle for Abbott and Costello to do their thing. And if you love Abbott and Costello, you're gonna love this. I'm a big fan of their work, and so I enjoyed this quite a bit. Really, when this movie is on, is when Abbott and Costello are doing their thing, for lack of a better word. My favorite scenes in the movie are when they're unloading these boxes into this House of Horrors type museum, and it's basically, like I said, it's Abbott and Costello doing their thing. It's who's on first, but with Universal monsters, and not exactly who's on first, but it's that dynamic. It's Costello reacting and Abbott being the straight man. In my research, I found out that Abbott and Costello were pretty difficult to work with. I believe there was something that Charles S. Barton said where they said that they would take off for days on end. They would play cards on set for hours, and they basically improvised a lot of their dialogue. And so largely they just could not be asked. But when you're on fire like Abbott and Costello were back in that period, I guess in their mind that they could pretty much get away with stuff like that. And I also learned in my research that both Abbott and Costello were suffering from separate health crises at the time. I believe with Abbott, he was suffering from heart disease and nearly passed away in 1943, and Costello was suffering from epilepsy. So they were dealing with problems of their own. I don't like the unprofessional behavior that Charles S. Barton talked about, but Abbott and Costello were clearly dealing with a lot, not just their waning popularity. You can't tell from the fact that they are still giving their all on screen, but it's just kind of the thread of this whole series and that what goes on behind the scenes is more interesting than what happens on screen. Seeing Bela Lugosi as Dracula will always just warm my heart. Like he just is the role for an entire generation, and he really does bring a lot to this. He does play into the comedy, but he also never forgets to be Bela Lugosi's Dracula. He retains the creepiness while also leaning into the humor. I appreciated the spirit of that. Once again, even though Lon Chaney Jr. is always good, it is unfortunate the case that they just have him there just to have him there. Even his death at the end of the movie is like, didn't we just do this? Like, it's literally him and Dracula swan diving off of a cliff into the ocean, which literally happened in House of Dracula. Come up with something more creative than that, guys. But the movie did have me laughing on more than a few occasions, and the ending is legitimately pretty memorable because it sees the horror debut of Vincent Price. And while Vincent Price had been an actor previously, it was his first horror role, if you really think about it. He's the cameo at the end where he is the Invisible Man and sends Abbott and Costello flying into the lake. It's great stuff. Overall, I'm going to give this movie a good rating. And I feel like I'm being a little bit generous, but at the same time, the movie did succeed in making me laugh on more than one occasion. But it's very clear that when you're teaming your like two tired acts up together and trying to make it work, you can tell like the writing had been on the wall, but now it's just been replaced by a big old neon sign, which is pretty clear because that would be the last standalone Wolfman film from Universal explicitly titled The Wolfman or something like it for over 60 years. And there would be other Wolfman films released. Of course, there would be from other studios, but in terms of Universal, it was clear that they were getting out of the monster business for the time being. But I pass it off to all of you. What did you think of the movie if you've seen it? Let me know in the comments. I would love to read what you have to say. And I have one more film left to cover in this series before Wolfman comes to theaters, and it is the only other Universal film explicitly titled The Wolfman. It was released in 2010. It was directed by the guy who directed The Rocketeer and star Benicio del Toro and Anthony Hopkins. I've never seen it, so I sincerely hope that it is good, and I will be joined in that review by a Wolfman, or well, close to it. It's Wolfman from Mega Movie Z. My name is Ryan Cam. I'll see you in the next one.